You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. The topic of sex education in today's world is highly controversial. For example, last year alone, 27 U.S. states introduced bills aimed at restricting sex education. These restrictions cover a lot of different areas. For example, some of them try to push sex ed back to later grades. Others aim to require explicit parental consent before a student can receive sex ed, while others aim to limit the scope of what can even be covered in these classes, such as limiting or removing any mention of LGBTQ issues or contraception. However, this fight over what sex ed should cover and whether it should even be taught at all in schools is nothing new. In fact, Americans have been having the same fights about school-based sex ed for over a century, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're doing a deep dive into the history of sex ed in the United States. Some of the topics we'll explore include how abstinence became so entrenched in American sex ed, whether abstinence programs actually work as intended, and what's holding us back from making progress in improving sex education. I am joined today by Margaret Grace Myers, a writer, researcher, educator, and former bookseller based in Maine. She is the author of the new book, The Fight for Sex Ed, The Century-Long Battle Between Truth and Doctrine. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Let's talk about something that happens in way too many relationships. The romance fades, the routines take over, and before you know it, you're more like roommates than lovers. Loss of intimacy is more common than you think, and it can have wide-ranging effects. It can create emotional distance, impact your self-esteem, and increase conflict. That's where Paired comes in, the #1 couples app that helps to improve your relationship and takes just minutes each day. Curated by relationship therapists, Paired uses expert-backed research to support making a lasting impact for couples. Here's how it works. You and your partner download the app and pair together. Every day, Paired sends you a 5-minute game, quiz, or question designed to deepen your relationship. Answer on your own time, and once you're done, Paired will reveal your partner's response so that you can have an open, stress-free, and honest conversation. One question we recently answered was, what about your partner do you find the sexiest? Both of us got a response that we hadn't expected. We both assumed that the other would tell us something about our looks, but what we really find sexy about one another runs much deeper than that. And that's one of the fun things about this app. We're always having new conversations and learning new things about each other. With Paired, you can start rediscovering each other one question at a time. Practice making your relationship a priority every day with Paired. Head to paired.com/Justin to get a 7-day free trial and 25% off if you sign up for a subscription. That's paired.com/Justin to sign up today. Hi, Margaret, and welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for joining me.
So happy to be here.
So you recently published a book called The Fight for Sex Ed that offers a comprehensive history of sex education in America. So tell us the brief story behind this book. Why did you want to write a whole book on this subject?
I had heard people say what I'm about to say before, and I had not understood it until this happened, where it was a book that I realized that I wanted to read. And then when I realized that it didn't exist, I thought, okay, well, I guess I have to write it now, which was actually really exciting. Basically, I was doing an MFA program in nonfiction writing. I was studying my great-grandparents. They were both biologists at the turn of the century in Baltimore. And I thought I was going to write about them. And I kind of realized I don't quite have that science down was really the problem. It was really kind of a craft issue. And what I realized is, maybe I just kind of write about their world. It was a world I didn't know a lot about, that sort of fascinating, really early 20th century. And one of the groups that they were part of was the Maryland Social Hygiene Society. They all had these sort of amazing names. Mm-hmm. One of the groups I talk about a lot in the book is the American Society for Sanitary and Moral Prophylaxis, which I think is just kind of the greatest, really kind of sums up the whole thing in a lot of ways. So social hygiene, for those who sort of aren't familiar, I certainly wasn't when I heard that phrase, there was this idea there were all these quote unquote social ills and social evils. One of those really being what was called venereal diseases, specifically syphilis. And so a lot of doctors were really concerned. And so social hygiene aimed to end all of these problems. And one of the ways that people were talking and thinking about was, do we talk to young people about sex? And do we do it in this way that feels different than maybe just saying don't have sex until you get married, even though that's actually where they really landed in a lot of ways. What really did it for me when I realized, oh, this is more interesting than I thought it might be, is when the debates that they were having, people, my great grandparents, 100 years ago, these were the same questions that I had heard in my own life, which was sort of, how early is too early? If we tell kids about sex, will they be more likely to have sex? If we tell kids about condoms, will that encourage them to have sex that they wouldn't have before? Are there these sort of untold horrors that could come? And I thought, how interesting is it to be reading about something that is presenting these issues that still feel alive? I realized, I actually don't know very much about sex ed in our country. And then when I realized we're still federally funding abstinence only sex ed, that was when I thought, okay, how did we get from that conversation in 1910 to where we are now? And how does it still feel like nothing has changed? And then also realizing the United States has some of the highest rates of teen pregnancies, some of the highest rates of STIs, probably the highest. I think it's just hard to calculate these things. And that is where I do say, I'm not an expert in that kind of thing. I am really a writer on the history level. But so that was really where it was born, was from this just total, thinking, how did we possibly get here? And then it took many years, and here we are.
Well, thanks for sharing that. So, in reading your book, it feels like we've constantly been having the same fight about sex ed for over a century. Every time a new curriculum is introduced and there's a push for more sex ed, you have this very vocal group of people who are against it because they think it covers too many controversial topics, or they argue about, like you said, how it's going to promote promiscuity, or they argue that, parents should be able to opt their kids out of it, and that it's the parents' responsibility to handle teaching their kids about sex in the way that they see fit. And I think a lot of people would assume that sex ed is something that has just gotten progressively better over time, but it really hasn't, because we just kind of litigate the same fight over and over. We're just stuck in this perpetual state of sex ed paralysis.
That's such a good way to think about it. That paralysis I will now be using, if you don't mind. That's exactly it. I mean, it is shocking. I remember at some point when I was going through the newspaper archives, which is how I did a lot of the constructing of the book, I just thought, well, I don't even need to go through, I can just guess what's going to happen next, because there will be sort of some advances. But basically, somebody says, hey, we have this great curriculum. It's so exciting. And then you just have the pushback. And very often the pushback wins and you get stuck. And what it's really also led to is a real disparity, because we have in some parts of the country, or, even in some schools in the same town, you can have really solid, really good sex ed curriculum, and kids, the next block over can be having this sort of really stagnant sex ed curriculum that could literally be from essentially 100 years ago. It's maddening.
Yeah. And I mean, it's even kind of hard to have a conversation about sex ed when you consider that people's experiences with it are so widespread and diverse and varied. When I teach human sexuality courses, one of the things I always ask my students is to reflect on what their own experiences with sex ed were like. And they're all over the map. Some people didn't get it at all. Some people just got the abstinence only talk, like don't do it. Some people got like all the scare tactics with, STIs, and here's all the terrible things that will happen if you do have sex. And then other people get more comprehensive education and actually had pretty positive experiences with it and learned what they need to know. So it's like when we hear the term sex ed, it doesn't mean just one thing. It can mean almost anything.
It's amazing. And there's a little bit of that in the book. I was able to put in some of that, but there was actually a lot of that in the kind of meta studies about sex ed, is that sex ed is hard to study for that very reason. So a lot of people like my parents' age and kind of in their late 60s will say, oh, well, when I was a kid, it was called family life education. And it's interesting because family life education was sort of its own thing, and it is its own thing. There was often sort of a part about sex ed. So they're sort of twins, it was a very complicated relationship. And I get to a little bit in the book. So you could kind of get sex ed in any number of classes because those family life education classes, that would be also where you would be learning, how to sew or do a budget. So it's like, maybe you're learning about STIs. Maybe you're learning about how to balance a budget. Maybe you're learning just somebody is saying, don't have sex until you get married. Maybe you're taking dating compatibility quizzes. One of the things I've been thinking about, is that a sophomore taking a calculus class in North Dakota and a sophomore taking calculus class in Maine might not be doing the same problem sets. But at the end of the day, the idea is like, you're going to learn some calculus. You'll be able to kind of speak the same language. And with sex ed, the Venn diagram is just two completely distinct circles. So it's like impossible to even discuss it. The stakes are sort of even higher when really what you have are two completely different goals of sex ed. And one is to have kids not have sex, which has never, ever happened. And by kids, I of course mean teenagers, adolescents whose bodies are just like, okay, time to have sex. And then the other kind of type of sex ed, which is to teach young people about having sex and provide all the information, which includes safe ways to have sex. I mean, it's a true nightmare. And then there are state laws and local laws and funding and
Yeah. Now, you mentioned terms like family life planning and social hygiene. And, so as I was reading through your book, I was thinking about how sex educators today, if you're on social media, have to talk about sex in this very coded language, right? So many of them will say segs, S-E-G-G-S, instead of sex. And so when you're looking historically, people were often using those terms like social hygiene or marriage training or family life education. And so there's always kind of been this coded language around sex education. And so, it's really not that different today in some respects.
That's so true. And right now it's so sort of different, right? Because the structure of, Instagram, right, where you're sort of would be blocked or, shadow banned or whatever for just saying sex. But, right, for different reasons, sometimes it's just distancing and saying, well, I'm not teaching sex ed because of some idea that we have about what sex ed is that has never actually matched up with what sex ed has ever been. And at least what I think now is I think sex educators are proud to be sex educators, which is really exciting. I think for a long time, people were hiding under being like the home ec teacher. And then they were like, okay, time to get to the sex part, oh God.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's one of those things where it's been hard historically because we've kind of had to teach sex ed in this more covert kind of way because it's so politically controversial. And so sometimes it's just kind of like, it was about sneaking in the sex ed wherever you could, as part of like a marriage course or home ec course or something like that. So what do you think is holding sex ed back? After exhaustively researching this subject, what are the key things that are really preventing us from making progress?
I wish this wasn't the case because it's such a bummer, but I think it's money and politics. That's the kind of one answer. And then the second answer, which is also related to that, I don't think there's a story about sex ed. I think understandably, people don't think about it very much. When I tell people I write about sex ed, almost everybody has a memory from sex ed. I tend to say that best case scenario is when people weren't traumatized. They don't have one sort of like horrifying story from their sex ed class. But other than that, I mean, it's just something that we don't think about, which makes sense. It's not like we're going around thinking about English class and why we have math class and all of these things. But I think people really don't know that it exists as it does. And it's always been so controversial. But since the late 1960s, when the religious right, I mean, really before abortion became the kind of sexual social issue, the religious right, I mean, glommed onto sex ed as the kind of evil of the world. It was, communists who were teaching your kids to be atheists and free love. And they were, sex educators were just trying to destroy the family. I mean, there were books and pamphlets and radio shows. I mean, Louisiana banned sex ed from 1961 to 1971. In the state, you were not allowed to teach sex ed. You had funding, it was very clear you sort of had funding pulled away from you if you taught sex ed in schools at all. That's really wild when you think about it. But it has not emerged in any sort of narrative way. And I mean, still, we have federal funding that really goes back and forth with the political party in charge of who gets more funding, whether it goes to these evidence-based. And then it's also complicated because a school district might have a really strong curriculum, but then the state might get funding from wherever. And then, the White House can say, okay, well, we're cutting that federal funding for this good, teen pregnancy prevention, which is this evidence-based program. And we're funneling all this money into what they're calling now sexual risk avoidance education, which is basically this rebranding of abstinence only. So it's just impossible to even tease apart where to put energy, where to be angry, who's making the decisions. And that's why I think you just can't get any traction. At this point, I'm sort of like, what was your question even? Just because it's all so complicated.
Summer is all about feeling good. Those long days and warm nights offer us some extra time to explore whatever it is that makes us happy. So why not take some of that energy into the bedroom? Whether you have a partner or you're flying solo, this is the perfect season to indulge in mind-boggling pleasure with Beducated. Beducated is a pleasure-positive learning platform that has helped tens of thousands of people just like you to find sexual happiness. They have hundreds of expert-led, easy-to-follow courses that will help you to explore new sensations, build deeper intimacy, and have way more fun in the bedroom. One course you'll definitely want to check out is called Roadmap to Intimacy. In this course, you'll learn how to cultivate a deeper connection with your partner, both physically and emotionally. It's full of amazing practical exercises that will help you to improve your communication, learn to be in the moment during sex, and bring more playfulness into the bedroom. So if you've been curious about trying something new, rekindling the spark, or just feeling more connected, now's the time. Make this summer one to remember with Beducated, where toe-curling pleasure meets expert-backed education. Get 60% off the yearly pass by using my last name, Laymiller, as the coupon code. This is an incredible deal and your discount is locked in for life. Try Beducated risk-free with a 14-day money-back guarantee. Check the show notes for the link and be sure to use my last name to get your discount. I mean, you're right. There are lots of different roadblocks to us improving sex education. And yeah, you can trace a lot of this back to fights about religious values in terms of what should and shouldn't be taught about sex. And, certainly there is a story and a role for that to play in all of this, but also the way it's been handled, treated by different politicians over time, also with different medical organizations getting involved in the fray. There isn't one finger to point and blame and say, this is why sex ed is so bad. It's really a confluence of a whole bunch of different factors over time.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, there's some really amazing groups that are doing really good work, but there's no sort of central body that says this is what sex ed looks like in America. And so for that reason, it can just kind of look like anything. And, you could have imagined that parents would be the ones who would be the most interested and invested. But parents have a lot going on. They very often just have no idea. I don't blame them for that. It's pretty grim, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is. Now, something that I think is interesting and kind of surprising in the history of sex ed is how wartime periods actually seem to be points in time when governments started taking sex ed and sexual health more seriously. Historically, it seems like our government didn't really care all that much about STIs until it started impacting military readiness by making a lot of men ineligible to serve. And it was kind of like they realized, oh yeah, this abstinence thing isn't really working and maybe we need to do more than that. Otherwise, we might lose this war, right? So tell us a little bit about how cultural factors like wars kind of changed the narrative around sex ed.
Absolutely. It's really fascinating. And that's actually was also one of the places that I became the most interested. So in the First World War, the secretary, some war people contracted the American Social Hygiene Association, which had become this kind of big umbrella group for all of the big sex ed groups, to kind of provide all this guidance because they knew that rates of STIs tended to rise in war times. There's this one quote, which was like, it is a matter of fact, that the prostitute follows the army, and that was really this idea was that, first of all, that STIs came from sex work, from the sex worker herself was this, which is, you think of now and you just think, how could that be possible? I mean, but that was where the blame was 100%. So the War Departments talked to who were the experts in apparently reducing these rates of STIs. And they said, so what do you recommend that we do? And so there were a whole bunch of recommendations. But the core of it was, of course, well, nobody should be having sex. And that is really, when you think about it, what is unique about America is the real insistence and, frankly, obsession with abstinence, abstinence before marriage. I study religion. People's beliefs are extremely important to them. I have nothing against anyone's beliefs, but it is a moral belief. So that was his core belief, right? Was like abstinence before marriage. But they also said, okay, so you have things like alcohol is not for sale anymore, quote unquote, camps of prostitution can't be near this. And they were allowed to give medical treatment if soldiers showed up with STIs. And this was all sort of still in the training camp, so still in the United States, World War I. And then the big issue was prophylaxis. This was before condoms really. It was all these kind of like injecting silver salts and all sort of extremely unpleasant sounding, not very effective things. But, you really had people who were saying, this is not logical. They're saying, hey, we are claiming that we want our young men to be abstinent. That is what we are saying in every single piece of literature and that is where you see these kind of all of these hilarious posters. Now they sort of seem campy and just over the top of like, she looks innocent, but she could carry syphilis, these kind of things. And so people really fought against having any kind of prophylaxis or even treatment, really. But it was the War Department who basically said, hey, we know these men are going to have sex. They just are. They absolutely are. It really became this major issue. And in World War I, it kind of didn't come so much to a head. It kind of dissipated, although many men contracted STIs. But by World War II, they, again, contacted the Social Hygiene Association, who were adamant. They were like, we do not want you to provide condoms. We're abstinent. So the War Department did decide. They were basically broke with the social hygienists. And they said, listen, we are going to provide condoms for these men. Basically because they knew from World War I, these men are going to be here and they are absolutely going to have sex. And they're going to do it because what they realized, frankly, it is a good lesson in basically what we all know, which is that people will find a way to have sex and they're going to do it. And you can either do it with protection or not. There's this one quote, Alan Brandt, who wrote this amazing book called No Silver Bullet about prophylaxis. They were giving 50 million condoms out each month during the war to the soldiers. But the people within that social hygiene community were upset. They really saw this as a complete kind of betrayal. And they said, what is our country standing for if you're going to do this? That we basically have planted our stake here. And actually that became this major sort of sticking point. And that sort of ASHA social hygiene establishment, social hygiene really became more conservative. And again, it's sort of what we had been chatting about earlier, where it does feel like everybody kind of has their hands in the work of sex ed. And you have these groups that are, again, they're not sort of in charge of anything. They're really the sort of advisory group, but they are becoming more conservative as these groups like the military are like, listen, it's not working. Your approach is not actually working. And we know that this is going to work. And then I do think you have this kind of reaction to that, which just means, okay, well, we're doubling down. That reaction is, I think, a huge part of why we have sex ed looking like we do today.
Yep. The reaction, counter reaction, everybody just kind of doubles down on their position and we're kind of in a stalemate. So a common argument in favor of abstinence-only education, and that you kind of alluded to here, is that the proponents of it think that it's going to discourage sex. Whereas if you provide comprehensive education and offer people even access to condoms or other things like that, or even just let them know where they can access those things, that's somehow going to encourage promiscuity. But what did the data really say? Does abstinence education actually work as intended?
Well, no, it doesn't. And what's really hard, and again, this is where I kind of put up my hands and say, I'm a writer. And so there are people who do this research who know it better than I do on that side of things. But what I gather, the thing to remember too, is that their aims are at odds. And that makes it really hard because the kind of abstinence only people and the comprehensive sex ed people have different goals. But if your goal is to lower rates of STIs, lower rates of teen pregnancy, and even have young people wait longer to have sex, comprehensive sex ed seems to lead to those outcomes. Abstinence-only sex ed does not lead to those outcomes. And it actually doesn't lead to any outcome, any demonstrable outcomes that I have found. The last good data that I saw really only said that abstinence-only sex ed does not change the time at which young people have sex. All it does is basically leads to less likelihood of using condoms. Some of the laws in certain states and frameworks and curriculum are so much, that you cannot mention condoms. And that assumes, of course, that penises are involved in the sex that's being had, but which, of course, is not always the case. But, that is the situation, is that young people truly do not know. Some of the studies that I had read seem to indicate that young people were committed to not having sex right after they took an abstinence-only sex ed class, but that tended to drop off after a few months. So it might initially work and then would fall off.
Yeah. And based on the data I've seen, the abstinence-only approach just doesn't work. Like, for example, in states that have higher rates of abstinence-only education, you have higher rates of teen pregnancy, right? So it's like, if this was working as intended, you would see better outcomes, but you're not seeing that. And in fact, you're often seeing the reverse.
You really are. And one of the things that was fascinating to me in the research was the abstinence-only camp made it out to be that they sort of invented the idea of sex ed, where they would indicate that remaining abstinent was a good idea. Whereas actually, that was the bedrock of all of sex ed. And still, frankly, comprehensive sex ed recommends delaying sexual intercourse for as long as possible. It's kind of, I forget what the phrasing is, but because outcomes tend to suggest that young people who wait longer just have better outcomes. When kind of abstinence only became its own thing, they really skewed the data in this way to say, well, what we're doing is so new that there isn't data about it. And this kind of raw sex that has been going on for so long, it's not working because look at all of these high rates of STIs. When of course, it's just like, that's just kind of not how it works. And also it's really hard to change behavior. That was something that I read kind of again and again in these studies, is that it's incredibly difficult to change behavior. I teach preschoolers in my other life. It's like, all you could do is give people the information. You can very rarely change someone's entire trajectory, and especially with something like sex. But if you tell a person, hey, you can get pregnant, but there's a thing called a condom, and it's cheap and it's easy, and here's how you use it, the likelihood that they will use that condom skyrockets.
Yeah. I think the real danger when it comes to sex ed is providing too little information, not too much, right?
Exactly. Well, and it's very interesting too. You get into some of these minutia of the different types of sex ed, and there's abstinence plus, where you can say condoms exist, but not how to use them. Or for a long time in, I think it was New York State, where you could only talk about condoms to emphasize their failure rate. So at that point, it's like, just why bring them up at all? Who knows? But it's just sort of, you're really setting up young people to be extremely confused.
I know this conversation has been a little bit bleak, but on a positive note, in the next episode, we're going to talk about how we can make sex ed better. So I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation, and maybe we can strike a more optimistic tone in that one.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Margaret. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yes, absolutely. The book is called The Fight for Sex Ed. Buy it at your bookstore, your local bookstore. If they don't have it, they'll order it for you, I promise. And then I'm mostly on Instagram these days, is the best place to find me. And I think I'm just Margaret Grace Myers there. This has been so wonderful. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.